This podcast is brought to you by the Maryland State Library Agency. The MSLA podcast features presenters from statewide youth programs, as well as learning opportunities for library staff and resources for patrons of the Maryland State Library for the Blind and Print Disabled.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Maryland State Library for the Blind and Print Disabled guest hour. I'm so excited this month because we are talking to Nicholas Redding of Preservation Maryland. Just to give you a little bit of background, Nicholas Redding has been leading the organization since 2014, overseeing operations, programs, and growth of professional staff. Under his leadership, the organization underwent a merger and established Smart Growth Maryland. He also collaborated with the National Park Service to launch the Campaign for Historic Trades. Beyond his organizational role, he serves as vice chair of the National Preservation Partners Network and has held leadership positions in various preservation organizations. Before joining Preservation Maryland, he worked at heritage sites and preservation organizations, including the Long Beach Plantation and the Civil War Trust. Mr. Redding is a graduate of Shepherd University and resides near Frederick, Maryland with his family. Welcome, Mr. Redding.
It's good to be here, and you're welcome to call me Nick.
Awesome. That makes it a lot easier.
Yes.
So just throwing it out there, how's Frederick, Maryland today?
It's beautiful right now. It's like perfect spring day. It is a little overcast, and it is probably about 70 degrees. People are out mowing their lawns, so you can smell the beautifully freshly cut grass. It's like a perfect day. It's a Friday that we're recording, and of course this weekend it's supposed to rain, so we're trying to soak in all the nice weather today.
Definitely. For those who don't know, we typically record our podcasts a month in advance, so it's a beautiful spring day, and too bad we're not doing this outside.
I know this would be the perfect day for an outdoor recording. You would hear birds chirping if I opened my window.
I'd love it. I love it. So, Nick, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Tell me, what is Preservation Maryland for people who don't know? When was it established?
Yeah, so we're the statewide historic preservation nonprofit organization, which means we're the organization that works to preserve historic places and help communities all across the state do that. And we were founded back in 1931. So we're a pretty old preservation organization here in the state. And in that time, since we've been founded, we have worked on a lot of different projects and really expanded our mission to focus on preserving a lot of different things. Interestingly, we were founded to help Maryland mark the bicentennial of George Washington's birth. So sometimes we joke that we were like one of the original George Washington slept here organizations. But since then, we have really expanded our work and have touched a variety of different historic buildings and structures. And now what we do is we focus on a couple different key areas. And so the way I would describe our work is we have a bucket of work that is focused on what we call historic property redevelopment, which is actually physically saving historic structures, managing their rehabilitation, partnering with people. And we have projects right now all across the state, and we can talk about specific projects where we're actually physically impacting a structure. And sometimes we'll own it and then sell it. Sometimes we'll partner with someone. There's a lot of different ways of doing that work. We also have another bucket called the Campaign for Historic Trades, and I know we're going to talk about that. And that's a workforce development, actually training people to do work on buildings. Then we have a bucket where we do advocacy. So we go to Annapolis and we make the case for the program, the funding, the policy that makes historic preservation and community revitalization possible. And then within that advocacy world, we also run a program called Smart Growth Maryland. And Smart Growth Maryland is focused on helping communities grow in smart and sustainable ways that respect their history, but also provide a place for communities to continue to grow and evolve and develop. And then we have a bucket of sort of education, outreach, and grant funding. So we make about over $100,000 a year worth of grants directly to projects across the state. And in addition to that, We do workshops and seminars and tours, and also have our own podcast. And we do that weekly. It's called Preservecast, and Ashley has been kind enough to offer that we're going to make it so that if someone listening to this is interested in learning more or listening to this, or you like hearing the sound of my voice, there are hundreds of hours of that available. So we are a dynamic organization in that we touch a lot of different things, and we try and find a lot of different ways to interact with people and communities to help them save places that matter to them.
That's a lot of stuff to do. I'm gonna ask a follow-up question that wasn't on the prepared questions, but you must have a staff of 100.
We don't have a staff of 100, we have a staff of 15. So we're fortunate in that we have a decent sized staff, but we certainly don't have a big enough staff to do everything. And so what we rely on are partners across the state. Our board, which is representative of different communities and different backgrounds, different skill sets, professional skill sets across the state. And then there's a lot of volunteer organizations and different types of organizations doing this work across the state. We partner with everything from state agencies like the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and the Maryland Park Service to counties. We're currently in partnership with Howard County, to municipalities. We currently have agreements and projects in partnership with the city of Annapolis, with the city of Brunswick, to organizations. We work with groups like the Maryland Center for History and Culture, with Historic Annapolis, and other groups like that, and that are staffed organizations. And then we work with small nonprofit organizations, some of which are all volunteer run, thinking of groups like the Washington County Historical Trust, that is preserving a beautiful historic structure in Washington County, and a host of other organizations. So it really is sort of a an all hands on deck moment to do historic preservation. It requires a lot of different work and a lot of different skill sets. Everything from financial planning to engineering to architecture to research to the actual physical work that it requires to restore a historic structure. There's a lot of different skill sets associated with getting this work accomplished.
That's amazing. Wow. So, my next question, just shifting gears a little bit, is can you tell us a little bit about the Preserving Place program?
Our historic property redevelopment program, which we kind of falls under the bucket of preserving places, is where we actually, as I was mentioning, physically work on historic structures. And that can be everything from when we buy and restore a structure, which is an example, a good example, most recent example of that was a little historic cabin. And I can take you on a little story here about this building. It was just a small little cabin, had siding on it, so you probably wouldn't have known it was made out of log. Even if you had gone up and touched it, you would have just felt sort of the smooth aluminum siding, sort of seemed like a modern structure. But in reality, what it was a very, very old historic structure. And its story and our involvement in it, and a good example of how this program works, starts with an accident. It is in Hagerstown, Maryland, in the Jonathan Street community, which is a traditionally in a very old African American community in Hagerstown, Maryland, and Washington County in the western part of the state. In the middle of the night, it gets hit by a police cruiser. There is police activity. Police cruiser goes off the road and hits the structure, and it is damaged really badly. And so they decide they're going to have to demolish it. Demolition contractor goes out to begin demolition, and they start pulling that aluminum siding off of it, and they realize, wow, this is really old, and they stop. And that gives us and community advocates time. They contact us and say, this thing seems really important, and we can't afford to lose any more structures in this neighborhood that has already lost a lot. And so we stepped in, we purchased it from the property owner, and we started doing the fundraising that would be necessary to raise the money that would be necessary to stabilize it, and then perhaps rehabilitate it, turn it into something that could be usable again. It was in really, really bad shape because it had been left vacant for some time after that accident. And we partnered with the Maryland State Highway Administration because they have a research archaeology program. And so they were able to do archaeology. And the first part of archaeology is research. So figuring out, well, who owned this place? Another part of archaeology can be digging, excavating in the ground and figuring out the story of the people who lived there, because oftentimes people don't leave written details of their life, but they leave other details like the little things they drop and the stuff that they put in their backyard. Then we also did something called dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings. So you can take a core sample from a log and figure out how old that log is and when it was felled, when it was chopped down. And we found out that the logs in this structure from that research were felled in the winter of 1739. And that's how precise it can get. Not only that, it can tell you what watershed it came from. So it came from the Conococheague Creek watershed, which is a watershed right outside of Hagerstown. So we knew that we had a structure that was older than the American Revolution, predated the American Revolution by almost 30 years. It had been disassembled and moved probably in the 1830s based on the evidence that we had. So when it was almost 100 years old, someone picked it up and moved it to another spot, which is where it sat when we found it. And we went through a long process of raising the funds to rehabilitate it. And then we let it be what it had always been, which was a home. And we sold it to a couple, which bought it, and it was their first home. It's very, very small. It's We put an addition on it where an addition had historically stood, that probably was put on in the late 19th or early 20th century. So we replicated that. And in total, it was about 900 square feet. So it's not a very big, very, very small. That is, probably the size of maybe a studio apartment in, a major city. But it's perfect. It's got a one bedroom, it's got a little sitting room, it's got a kitchen, and that also doubles as sort of a entryway to the house. The second floor is basically just mechanicals and storage. But it is now protected. We put a conservation easement on it, meaning it can never be demolished. And so we get to oversee any exterior changes that are ever made to it. But in doing this, not only did we save a structure, but this gets to the broader point, and the broader hope for the program is that it can help spur revitalization in a broader community. And it brought a lot of attention to Jonathan Street. We were able to get a lot of people focused on it. It was front page news in a lot of different newspapers, covered by everything from Smithsonian Magazine to architectural magazines and digests. And it has brought attention and money to the local community center. Which is now restoring a historic pool that hopefully kids in the neighborhood will be able to swim in this summer. So it really has elevated the history of that community. There were exhibits at local museums about the history of that community. There was an archaeology exhibit in Hagerstown about all of this. There was a documentary that is airing on PBS stations around the country. And it all started with that structure and that rehab project. And I think that really shows the power of preservation to get people excited about a community and help invest in a community, and not just look past and look backwards, but look forwards as well.
I'm amazed. I'm amazed. Now, how long did that take? I mean, you said it took some time.
Well, we found out about what had happened prior to the pandemic. And then I bought, well, I didn't buy it, but the organization bought it. I say I because I went to the closing in the summer of 2020. I remember it was a socially distanced closing. We can all remember that. I had to sit in a room by myself and sign all the closing papers. And somebody sat in another room and watched me. And then we wrapped that project in 2021. So it took several years from initially finding out about it to design to doing all the fundraising. Required several $100,000. We actually had to lift the structure off of its foundation and then rebuild a foundation underneath of it to make sure the foundation it was sitting on was firm and secure. So we had to do some engineering to do that. It was a complex project, although what's interesting is that log structures anyone ever played with Lincoln Logs as a kid, they they kind of just stack on each other, and they're not too dissimilar from a Lincoln Log in that if one part of it kind of falls over, you can kind of just restack them. And so log is very forgiving as a building material, and we were able to just kind of where the car had hit it and had pushed it in, we were able to kind of just pull it back out again. It's not quite as easy because it's actually quite heavy, but that's effectively what's happens from an engineering standpoint. So we were able to put the structure back together, lift it up, make sure the stone foundation under it was secure and rebuilt where it needed to be, set it back down, make sure it had a secure roof on it, and then did all of the interior work. It needed all new electric, all new plumbing, all new mechanicals. So it has all new air conditioning and everything. It's basically, with the exception of its almost 300, year old um, building material, it is new from the sense that it has new interior finishes. We tried to leave a lot of the log exposed where we could, at least on the inside, so that you can see what the ceilings would have looked like historically because they were not covered. And in the addition, where it meets the exterior of the house, the log is still exposed so that you can kind of see that and you can feel it. And that's really, sort of a cool experience in that. And I know for this audience is really important, sort of that tactile experience, and you can have that with this structure. And that's one of the really cool things about it is that you can reach out and touch this historic structure, and you're not just touching a log, you're touching something that has stood for nearly 300 years, which is a unique experience.
So cool. So awesomely cool. So my third question to you is about the campaign for historic trade. How did Maryland get involved? What is it?
So, the Campaign for Historic Trades is a national program run by Preservation Maryland. And kind of going back to that previous story that I told, in order to do all of that work and fix those logs and rechink them, which is where you take chinking material and you stuff it in between the logs. That's what keeps wind from blowing into them and keeps them um, watertight and all those sort of important things. Everything like that, from building the roof to dealing with logs to resetting a stone foundation, they all require a different set of skills associated with historic preservation and with historic trades, is what we call them. And not surprisingly, some of those skills are hard to find. It is difficult to find not only people who know them, but people who can train in them. And even if you are interested in doing that work, you might have a hard time finding a place that could train you or could teach you to do it. Becoming a timber framer is not an easy thing to do, or becoming somebody who knows how to put on a slate roof or a copper roof for that matter. And so we're fortunate in Maryland that the National Park Service, which maintains and restores historic structures and is responsible for a lot of that work in the federal government, their historic preservation training center is located in Frederick, Maryland. And they were looking for a partner that could help them do certain things that can be challenging for a federal agency. A lot of people might be familiar with the fact that a lot of parks, like a Fort McHenry or something like that, have a friends group. Well, this Historic Preservation Training Center needed a friends group as well. And so that's kind of how it started, supporting the Park Service, but then it kind of has gone beyond even that. And what we've done is we've created apprenticeships that young adults and people changing careers, recent veterans can take to help them guide them into a career in the historic trades. And those trades that we've created apprenticeships for include historic window technician, so restoring a historic wood window. A lot of people are familiar with those. We have a historic carpentry, a preservation carpenter apprenticeship, so working in wood. And then we also have a deconstruction technician, which is the work associated with taking a building apart, sometimes because that building is no longer able to be lived in or restored, or sometimes a building is going to be restored, but portions of it have to be deconstructed before you can fix them. And that's a very normal thing. And knowing how to take a building apart safely And so that pieces of it can be reused or so that the building is not damaged in the process is an important skill set. It's not just about going in there and whacking it with a hammer. There's different ways of taking a structure apart. And from an environmental stance, it's better to deconstruct a building than demolish one, because then those materials can be reused. And it takes a lot of energy to make brick, to cut down a tree and turn it into lumber. And that can be reused. And people love that material when it's being reused. So all of these are very important aspects. And so we recruit people for these apprenticeships. We help employers create programs because an employer has to be involved as well. You have to have lead to a full-time job in an apprenticeship. So it's a dynamic program that continues to grow and is impacting projects and partners all across the country.
That's really awesome. So, how did you come to be part of Preservation Maryland? I know that you have a very long history of preservation work. Is that how you got into Preservation Maryland?
Yeah,
Through
so I went to school in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, and got a degree in history and historic preservation. And then I was working for what was then called the Civil War Trust, what's today called the American Battlefield Trust. And that's an organization that saves historic battlefields because not all battlefields are preserved, and not even all portions of pretty important battlefields like an Antietam here in Maryland or Gettysburg in Pennsylvania are completely protected. And so I was involved not only in the land acquisition side, but then I also had an opportunity to work on the advocacy side. So making the case for battlefields that were threatened. I worked on an effort to protect the Gettysburg battlefield when it was threatened by the construction of a casino on its boundary. Someone had proposed building a casino there, which we thought was a pretty bad idea. I worked
I bet.
at the Wilderness battlefield when that was threatened, and supported our team when they were working to prevent the construction of a Walmart on the edge of that battlefield. So I got a chance to work in advocacy. And then I ran a historic site in Clark County, Virginia, which is in the Shenandoah Valley, the northern part of the Shenandoah Valley, which is where Berryville is, if anyone's ever been to Berryville, Virginia, not far from Winchester. And ran a place called Long Branch Plantation, or historic site. And that was a historic 18th, early 19th, late 18th century structure that also had a 400-acre working farm attached to it. And so we told the story of the enslaved and told the story of the people who had built that structure and how it had been preserved and its role sort of in American history. And then from there, I had the opportunity to go to Preservation Maryland, where I've been for the past 10 years, working to preserve historic places all across the state. I think one of the exciting things about preservation nowadays is that we get the opportunity to lift up a lot of different voices, because everyone deserves to see themselves reflected in history and hear their voices in history. And the exciting thing is that everything has a history. No matter what you're thinking about, it has a history. And that's an interesting way of kind of changing our understanding and making sure that all of that history is reflected in the story of the state and of the nation.
So, in these last 10 years, what would you say would be the biggest contributor to your organization's success in preserving Maryland's history?
So I do think the expansion of the story of what we preserve and making sure that we are working across disciplines, across communities with different groups and different organizations and different traditions, and oftentimes groups that are underrepresented in the story is important because it allows us to work with a lot of different people. So that's exciting. I think working physically on structures gets people excited because they get to see a very specific project like that cabin, which had unique stories and history embedded in it, part of an African American community that in many ways had been overlooked. We were able not only to elevate that story, but to use one structure to tell a much bigger story about a community. And I think that's an easier jump for people to make when they can see one building and kind of understand it in those terms instead of something so broad and so big that it's difficult to completely understand. So working in physical structures like that. I also think the historic trades program has been a way for us to very specifically show how preservation not only matters to the economy because these are real jobs, but how preservation can play a role in addressing big challenges that confront our communities, like making sure that everybody has a job. This is a way that somebody with a high school education, you don't necessarily need to go to college in order to have a fulfilling career that allows you to support a family. You can work with your hands. And not only that, but you can do stuff that matters to a community and save important places and be a part of that um, process. Because we sort of joke, but it's no joke. Without the trained hands to do this work, preservation is just good intentions. You
I like
actually
that.
have to be able to physically do this kind of work. And so I think that that has been a big component of it as well. And I think just broadening our message so that we talk to more people. I think the podcast allows us to reach a bigger audience and talk to people who perhaps otherwise wouldn't be seeking out our story or the resources that we're protecting, but get exposed to us in a new way. So yeah, I think it's broadening the story, finding physical ways to connect people to places, engaging in workforce development, which is a unique thing for historic preservation organization, and reaching people in a variety of different ways and new methods that are accessible to a whole host of different folks who perhaps otherwise wouldn't reach us.
I love that line. That was a great one-liner. I wanna put that on a mug. Without, trained hands, preservation is just a good idea.
Yeah, yeah, we should put that on a mug or a bumper sticker or something like that.
That hit hard. That hit hard. 'Cause so my background's, long, long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. I went to school for archiving, records management, preservation of records mostly, and this is gonna lead into my next question, of course. So that line just, like, hit me hard. I was like, "Oh my god, that sounds like something that my old professor would say." I wanna talk about one particular community that I noticed Preservation Maryland really, hit the ball out of the park with. June is Pride Month, and, Preservation Maryland has done quite a bit to do that. In fact, in 2020, Preservation Maryland studied historical sites important to the LGBT community. Can you tell us a little bit about that study?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, it's a perfect time to discuss this, and I kind of touched on this idea of making sure that everyone sees themselves reflected in history, and that builds a bigger constituency for preservation in history because everyone has a piece of it, and that was part of the thinking, just one part of tackling this project. The other is we want to make sure that historic sites associated with this community are not only documented, but then are set up to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places and then receive funding when funding comes available to preserve them because we know that they're important. So, doing the initial upfront research is critically important in historic preservation. It's the first start and the first stop is documentation, and a lot of that documentation starts with in historic preservation something called a context study, where you sort of study the context in which any particular building type or community evolved over the history in a community or in a broader community. So, like in a state or even in a nation, sometimes you can look at the context of a particular building type, or as I said, a particular community. And so we were looking at LGBTQ history in Maryland, here in the Old Line State, over the course of Maryland history, and even predating what we know as Maryland to our pre-colonial, our indigenous history as well, and trying to see not only what the context of that is, but what sites persist and have survived that help us tell that story. And so this report looks at rural, suburban, urban locations. It includes sites associated with non binary historical figures, leading out elected officials, community groups, and gay bars, places where people gathered, advocacy for AIDS treatment and marriage equality, and the sites where those stories unfolded, and a lot of other important places. And not only in addition to that context study, but we also created a database of nearly 400 important sites associated with LGBTQ life. Those represent places in every one of Maryland's counties. So it's not just a story, with cities. As I said, it's urban, rural, suburban. It cuts across all aspects of Maryland life. And it was a part of a multi-year commitment to highlighting and elevating LGBTQ heritage. And so we hired some of the leading historians in this field. A person by the name of Susan Ferentinos compiled and did the research on the report that then was turned into an abridged version that you can find on our website. And we've also done a podcast on it. So if people are interested in listening to a story or a more in-depth conversation about how the research was put together, we have that as well.
Well, I have to tell you that database that you put together, that interactive, it's an interactive crowdsourced map, was unique. I follow a lot of historical websites and stuff like that just because I'm a nerd and gotta fact check the History Channel. So I thought that was really unique. So can you tell me how that came to be?
Yeah, so we worked with some folks at the time to crowdsource that information, and we hosted events across the state. This predated the pandemic, so we were able to get together in person. We were able to put together that crowdsourced map, as you described, that then allowed people to kind of put their story on the map and identify sites that were important to the broader story of Maryland history, but also this specific context, and this study that we were doing at the time. And so places popped up that were really interesting, were places where people received care, whether that be for AIDS or early efforts for the trans community and care for the trans community. There are sites associated with, as I mentioned, AIDS, but AIDS hospice care that we didn't know about that communities were able to share with us. Places where people gathered, places where student advocacy took place near Johns Hopkins, at University of Maryland, different bars and community groups, and I mean, you name it, we learned about it and were able to crowdsource it. And the cool thing about that is not every site can be saved, and sometimes these sites didn't even exist anymore, but we were able to put them on the map. And so this virtual resource allows us to still maintain the memory of a site that perhaps no longer even exists, which I think is really important for any historical endeavor, because a lot of what we preserve or what we highlight are places that still exist. And so as a result, communities that don't have that physical connection sometimes are left out of the story. And these types of activities and efforts allow us to mark a whole host of different places. And that's not to say that everything has been lost, it hasn't, but it allows us to do both, which is really exciting. And so there are a whole host of different places. I mentioned that Johns Hopkins, the gender identity clinic, dates back to the 1960s, and was one of the first places in the country to provide coordinated care for transgender patients who wish to receive gender affirming medical intervention. I mean, there's a whole host of unique and interesting sites associated with this story in Maryland that we're able to document.
Do you mind if I ask a follow-up question?
Sure, sure.
This interactive map is so unique in so many ways. I've not seen it on many historical websites. Are you planning to implement the same type of tool for other projects in the future?
Yeah, I think we are looking at doing more context studies. And perhaps that kind of mapping component as well. This is, for Pride Month, this is a really interesting one to talk about. We've done and a story that hasn't been told before. We've done other context studies, a little totally like different theme, but we did one about the history of school construction in Maryland.
Neat.
And so lots of different school typology, everything from, early 19th century one-room schoolhouses to mid-century mod, 1960s and sort of postmodern 1970s schools. So, that probably lends itself. We are currently doing a study of all the cultural resources of the Maryland State Park System, the first comprehensive study of its kind. It's believed that the Maryland Department of Natural Resources and Maryland Parks own and maintain more historic structures than any other organization in the state of Maryland. So we're partnering with them. They are fantastic partners to document all the different typology of historic resources that they have. So we engage in this a lot, but you're right, it is unique to this project, and I think it lends itself well to telling a story like this that has not been well documented. We had to rely on communities to help us tell their story, and I think that that's a really important and important aspect to this that was a lesson because we were only the second state in the nation to do a statewide context study of LGBTQ history. Kentucky, interestingly, was the first, but Maryland was the second. And so I think it creates a guide for other states doing this. There have been cities that have done it. New York City, notably, has done one as well. But I think it's an important lesson for people thinking about doing this kind of work and any kind of preservation that it's important to talk to communities. You know, I was at a conference yesterday that was about planning, sort of in that smart growth vein. And one of the things that was mentioned there was, it's really important to talk to communities about how they want to grow, which seems sort of like a no brainer. But I think it's important to remind people who work in these fields day to day that this work can't be done without talking to the communities that, the story you're trying to tell or the community you're trying to plan. And I think this map is a good reminder of the value and the power of that because you're going to learn about things that otherwise could be overlooked.
I'm going to encourage everyone to go and check it out. It is the whole study and everything is available on Preservation Maryland's website, which, is very well laid out. Very logical.
Good, good. I'm glad to hear that you like that.
Well, I've run across some historic websites that are kind of like, oh, well, if you wanted to read this, click here, and it takes you to like another website somewhere. Like it's all piecemeal. But this is Preservation Maryland's website is just fabulously done. So I love it. I love it.
Cool. And I should say too that Benjamin Eagerman and Megan Bacco, who were both with the organization at the time that we put that together, were critical in pulling it together. So as we talk about communities and people who were involved in it, I definitely have been supportive of it the entire time, but it takes a whole team, and those two, along with Susan Ferrentinos, who I did mention, really helped spearhead that. And Ben, who has a background in libraries as well, was critical in getting that map together and doing that work. And Megan, who now runs a heritage area in the state of Maryland, was critical in that project as well. So yeah, there's a whole team behind this, and they were instrumental in making sure that we heard from all those different communities and that we were able to lift up those stories.
I love that. Lifting up stories is so great, and I think that's it sounds like that's a big part of what Preservation Maryland is really about. It's not just about preserving the historical place, but preserving the story of the community around it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, if you're not telling a story and you're not making the building valuable to the community today, then preservation is sort of like in a vacuum. And I think what we have to do is we have to activate places, we have to explain why they matter, and we have to find a use for them that is of value to, our current communities. And whether that be housing, whether that be telling a story and being a historic place and a more traditional historic site, or whether it be adaptively reused and turned into a restaurant or something like that. You have to put buildings to work. They have to have a job, because if they don't, people won't care for them and they fall apart. I mean, that's basically the end of it. And I think preservation is at its best when preservation is done in such a way that the community finds value in that new use, whether that be its traditional use, like at that cabin that stayed a house, or whether that be a use that's not quite as traditional and is adaptive and is sort of a new use, breathing new life. It's a brewery now. Thinking of places in Baltimore like the Ministry of Brewing, which is an old church that now is a brewery. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to reuse a historic place, and a lot of that starts with listening to the communities about what they need.
So, in closing, if you really had just a few minutes to say, tell someone about Preservation Maryland and the work you do, what do you want them to walk away with?
Yeah, I think we are an organization that provides resources, technical assistance, and support to help communities harness the power of historic places. So, how do you take a historic place and add value to it? And that, when you get into the details of that, it goes in a lot of different directions, everything from training people to physically do the work, to providing grant funding, to coming in and being a partner to help restore a building or to research a community, but we're an organization that helps people harness the power of these historic places and help people save places that matter to them. And in doing so, like you said, we lift up different voices and different stories and make sure that everyone can see themselves reflected in Maryland's history.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Well, thank you so much for being part of our podcast. We are so excited to have Preservation Maryland and you here because it's a story that needs to be told.
Great. Well, it's fun to be here. And I would invite listeners if they, as I said, if they enjoyed this, we do have Preserve Cast. I know Ashley is going to make
Yep.
some of that available and at least provide the link. But we've got a whole host of interviews with people from all across the world engaged in the work of historic preservation and saving places and telling important stories. So we love more listeners, and we're excited to be here with you today.
Great. Well, I'm going to wrap up and tell everyone thank you so much for being here with us again this month. Enjoy your June, and we will see you again next month.
This has been a presentation of the Maryland State Library Agency. For links to additional resources provided by today's presenter, please visit the show notes. For more information on MSLA or the Maryland State Library for the Blind and Print Disabled, visit marylandlibraries.org.